This interview is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History.
Hello, I'm Bob LeBrant, and on behalf of the Michigan Political History Society, we're doing an interview today with Tom Downs. Tom Downs was an attorney and a lobbyist with the Michigan CIO, which later merged into the AFL-CIO. He was also one of those groups of activists that transformed the Michigan Democratic Party in the post-World War II time period. Tom was elected a delegate and served as vice president of the Constitutional Convention and is a recognized election law specialist and recount expert across the nation. Tom, you were born in Spokane, Washington back in 1916. Tell us a little bit about your parents and your years growing up in Washington State.
Yes, I'll be glad to do that. I have to go back quite a while to remember that. That's quite a while back. But my parents, I think, were interesting. My father was a doctor, and he was a Republican. I think he was more of a libertarian. And I remember the one election in '32, he voted for Hoover, and my mother voted for Norman Thomas, a socialist. And the community criticism was not she voted for a socialist, but that she voted different from her husband. Now, my father was wise enough not to try to tell her how to vote, but I don't think I've heard a new political argument since then. Now, my father, when he was later on, took a special course to be a brain surgeon. There weren't very many of them. The neighborhood kids always said he ought to put some brains in me. And he had a terrific analytical mind that, you know, most people do a jigsaw puzzle, they get the corners and try to fit them. He'd look at the jigsaw puzzle, not make a move, and maybe after 15, 20 minutes put the whole thing together at once. And he'd remember the last cards that were played. So he had a very analytical mind and very independent. I remember this was, Orientals were out there, and he was the only doctor that let the Oriental come in his office and sit with the other patients. It wasn't he was sound on racial issues so much as a libertarian, he was going to do things his own way. Now, my mother was a very warm person. She was in all the ecology groups, the Audubons and the Garden Club. She took me to a lot of lectures. I remember, Roy Chapman Andrews that discovered the dinosaur eggs in China, and Count Felix von Lecter, the one that did the Friendly Arctic. So she got me interested in a lot of things like that, and I think she got a lot of the adventurousness, and maybe probably more than my father did. And he was a very analytical person, great chess player. My mother certainly was no slouch. She, after my father died, she was a head of directive halls, and she got a Phi Beta Kappa in her 40s, which was pretty old at that time.
And she lived to what, 102 times?
She made 102, yes.
Remarkable.
Yes, she was remarkable. Now, as far as the schools go, it's kind of interesting that I remember in the 4th grade, the teacher said that Columbus was the first one to figure out the Earth was round. Well, I knew better than that, and I thought the teacher wanted, you know, tell the kids straight things, so I raised my hand and straightened her out. And much to my chagrin, she didn't appreciate it. Well, I think a tremendous lesson I learned then was that if people don't like to be criticized, it's kind of anthropology 101. They're more interested in survival than they are in the facts. And I've had to try to remember that as the years go on, and not directly criticize someone, particularly if I'm right, particularly if they're in a superior position. So the other lesson I learned, this was an interesting one, that I was the shortest one in the class in the 6th grade, and there wasn't a teachers union then. The principal also was the umpire for the ball games, the recess, but we'd never get to the fielders because the bell would ring before then. So I organized the fielders, I mean solid. And we suggested that you start with the last one. If the third baseman in the last one out, then the fielder would be next. Well, she was outraged at that. And I kind of learned then that people don't like a 6th grade kid telling them how to run their business. So it was, but I mean, it was I'd say basically a happy childhood. Now, high school was kind of interesting experience. I was on the debate team. Well, they had what they did, they'd have a kind of kids could pay a dime to go to the debate or write a book review. So that's the way they raised the money for the debate team. And I remember we had the debate and something about old age pensions, the other side said something about raising chickens. Well, my parents were rather permissive. I grew chickens and bees in the backyard for my Boy Scout merit badge. And I started telling about the problem of raising chickens. I had to cut its head off and how it got loose, and the dog chased it into the neighbors, and I followed with a hatchet in my hand, and it got mixed up in the laundry of the woman next door. Well, the students they got hilarious and laughed. And then at the end, the students would judge things. Well, they not only clapped for me, I got a standing ovation. But then the teachers that judged it said I hadn't followed the rules. I said, well, just said those were suggestions on what you had to say. Well, it's kind of interesting. One teacher stood up for me and said, well, they worked it out that I could be on the debate team. They wouldn't use me on the first string, but they'd use me when they need to raise dimes. So I learned then when you get an offer like that, take it and grab it and run with it. But a little more on my father, that he told the story that his father, I'm named Tom Downs, no middle name. His father was named Thomas Jefferson Downs, and he such a good Republican, he dropped the Jefferson. So I think at least my great-great-grandfather mother was a Jeffersonian Democrat. But he told about Mark Hanna being in the House in Connersville, Indiana, and how they'd get the votes, I think it's for McKinley, telling the farmers if they voted Democrat, their mortgages would be foreclosed, and the workers, their jobs would be out of the way. And he became an Indian agent. My grandmother's a wonderful person. I'm just sorry I didn't get to know her more. She traveled all around when he was an Indian agent. But
well, you're quite a traveler yourself, and I understand in your youth you had a number of journeys, once up to Alaska, and then tell us about your post-high school.
Yeah,
as well.
I was an active Sea Scout, and then we went from Seattle up to northern Prince Rupert, and then turned around in Alaska. One year I was a first mate, and the other time the engineer, and we had one real old fellow, 21 years, and I liked that a lot. And then after high school, there were three of us had a Model T Ford in 1921, and this is about 1932, and we went to the World's Fair in Chicago, and the world was so different then. We didn't have sleeping bags. We'd just sleep by the side of the road, and then in the morning somebody would come by and say, Ma wants to know if you want a cup of coffee. We'd go in the farmhouse, and Ma would give us breakfast, learn what we're doing, pack us a lunch. Well, I wouldn't want a grandchild doing that kind of trip now. So it was a fun experience. And we had dogs a lot. I remember the one dog got kind of old and had goiter and, let's see, cataract and rheumatism. My father had given the latest medicine for it. And then after he died, well, we got a pup. And it cried all one night. And my mother was kind of soft-hearted, thought I needed some company, so he slept on my bed from then on. And then my mother was kind of unusual. She's very practical. This one dog we had to show he was a boss dog, very nice house dog, and he'd get in fights. Well, they didn't have dogs on leashes, and I remember the men would come in, and one would grab one dog by one collar and the other with his other hand. The dogs turned around and bite him. Well, my mother kept a pail of water on the porch. When the dogs would fight, she'd walk up to them, dump a pail of water on them, and that stopped a dog fight every time.
Tom, let's turn to your Ann Arbor years. When you enrolled at the University of Michigan, what was your major?
Well, I started out in engineering school, and I was there a year and a half, and I didn't do bad. One course I flunked was descriptive geometry. That's three-dimension stuff really got me. But I had a very good advisor. I happened to be the only socialist on the faculty. He suggested I get in something more related to people, so then I switched to sociology. Now there's some interesting things that we'd hitchhike up to the Flint sit-down strikes. And I remember I think I learned more outside of school than in school, that we'd go in they had mimeograph machines and slept coffee. And I remember the newspaper saying that this was the communist conspiracy to take over industry. And I asked this one fellow, was that so? And he looked at, well, you dumb college kid. When I was running coffee, and he leaned over and he parted his hair and showed a great big scar. I said, well, what about that? Well, he'd been on a picket line in the Detroit or Hamtramck, and the mounted police hoof just cut his head right open. He said, when I'm in this plant, there's no horse going to get at me. Well, that was a very pragmatism of the American workers, was not trying to destroy the shop, but to keep from having their heads